Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM. Welcome to another edition of Food Farm Talk, where we celebrate food and honor those who champion the cause of food in society.
Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM in Guelph, Ontario. I'm your host, Emily Duncan, and the show is also hosted by Abdul-Raheem Abdulai and Paul Smith. If you didn't tune in last week, you definitely missed out. We aired the first part of a collaborative panel discussion and are airing part 2 today. The Arrell Food Institute, in partnership with the Food from Thought initiative at the University of Guelph, has been hosting a series of webinars that focus on discussions around food, agriculture, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. All these panel discussions feature experts from the University of Guelph. During this 2-part episode, the topic is centering around COVID-19 plus social impacts on rural communities. The second part of this episode will be hosted by Dr. Philip Loring, the Arrell Chair in Food Policy and Society, and our own co-host, Abdul-Raheem Abdulai, an Arrell scholar and a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography, will also be a panelist. The discussion will also include Dr. Ryan Gibson, who's an associate professor and the Libro Professor in Regional Economic Development. He's in the Rural Planning and Development Program in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development. Odame, and she's a professor of capacity extension in the Capacity Development and Extension Program, also in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development. And finally, Jacqui Empson Laporte, she's an environmental specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. So we'll tune in right where we left off last week on the discussion now. Thank you.
Abdul, it has me thinking that, being a newcomer to Canada, rural Canada could be a challenging social environment in a normal year, and of course now everything we're hearing and that we're talking about now, it's an even more I don't want to say extreme, but challenging environment. And Ryan mentioned services for newcomers, and I just wonder if you have any thoughts on the newcomers that are coming to Canada, the challenges they're facing. You mentioned technology. If you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, so again, thank you for the question. Being a newcomer myself, and I would say having gone through a bit of experience all the way from Newfoundland to Ontario here, I've seen a fair bit of like what it takes for newcomers to settle in rural Canada. And I think back in Newfoundland, I did a bit of work that looked at like newcomers, trying to attract newcomers into agricultural sector in rural communities. I'll just speak to some of that work to build on it. And some of the things that we actually found, like for most newcomers, like myself, has always been finding a community within a community. So if you are a newcomer that is going into a remote area, somewhere like in rural Newfoundland or like rural Ontario, that you don't find people that you can easily relate to, it becomes hard to settle in. So we've seen calls where people will want to like say come in with their families, because that provides them the support network they need in order to settle in within the place. But just moving into a new area by just being like an individual by yourself can sometimes be really challenging. And of course, we are in very challenging times, which would mean that the situation might be much more worse than like even pre-COVID-19 period. And another important thing that I do know from newcomers has always been issues of food, and that ties into culture, right? Because people have the food they eat. Even myself being here in Guelph, sometimes I do struggle to find food that I easily relate to. And for certain times, I do have to move to Toronto to buy food. Like just to be able to still remain close to home in terms of the food I eat. So in terms of like rural communities, the ability of rural communities to more or less like diversify what the kind of food that is available out there, that can actually be a very crucial factor in terms of attracting newcomers post-COVID, or like helping newcomers to actually settle in. So I do think that's, but from my personal experience as well, I do know that rural communities have inherent characteristics, like as Ryan mentioned earlier. There's a lot of features in rural communities that will be very vital in recovering from COVID-19 and in terms of long-term sustainability and resilience of rural communities. Because we do know that even at the middle of this pandemic, we've seen a lot of calls in Ontario where the Premier was kept on like emphasizing that people should not go to their cottages, people should not move to their rural areas. So it gets us thinking what is inherent in those rural communities that people actually want to go there. Mm-hmm. First of all, people might just think about just the scenery and the fact that people go there to relax. But there's more to rural communities, because as people are beginning to quote unquote flee from the densities in urban areas post-COVID, as people become more skeptical, more afraid of like densities, we may see a surge in people trying to either settle in a rural community, be it newcomers or be it just Canadians who actually will want to go to rural communities in order to settle in. Mm-hmm. So like those inherent characteristics by the low densities in rural communities could actually be a very important factor in actually getting more people into rural communities, or like in the ability of rural communities to actually recover from this as well. And so most times it can also be like an appeal to newcomers as well, because if you come from a rural area in somewhere sub-Saharan Africa, like myself, like if you are coming into an area, sometimes you might find it very hard settling into a large community. Like personally coming to Canada and like entering through Corner Brook in Newfoundland, it was a very important phase in my life, because going into a much more smaller community was very instrumental in the way I was able to transition into Canada, right? So it plays a lot into how like we try to put in place institutions post-COVID that will be able to attract newcomers and try to make more rural communities more attractive.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned, and it's really offered a fantastic segue to our third sort of planned question. You mentioned recovery and you mentioned resilience, and we really want to do sort of have a forward-looking component of this conversation. And so maybe Helen, could I ask you to comment a little bit on the future and resilience sort of in the short term, but then what?
Sure. So we have to have an exit strategy for the pandemic, and our exit strategy, in my opinion, has to ensure that the way forward is one based on a caring economy, and I mean that very intentionally. We have learned through this crisis about the importance of caring for one another, caring for our environment, caring for our country as Canadians, and caring for newcomers, and caring for those who are not well, who are struggling, who are jobless. So the exit strategy has to be based on, in my opinion, on a caring economy. This caring economy going forward will have a deep connectivity, because these are the connections, these are the things that connect one of us as individuals, as families, as communities and societies across this big country. So connectivity is absolutely essential, should be priority number one or within the top three, in my opinion, because that infrastructure underlies all of the new social practices that we will have to develop going forward, and our capacity for adapting to this new context, but also all the services, all the economic opportunities that improved connectivity can bring about. So we need to be very creative and very industrious, hardworking to make this happen. And what I'm really pleased about is that while attention to rural broadband has sort of gone up and down over time, it has really climbed. The awareness of this has really climbed in the last few months, and every Canadian is now beginning to recognize that we're paying a big cost because we're not connected within this country. We also need science. So maybe I'm a scientist and a researcher, but I do believe that the evidence and the data, the research initiatives that we need to evolve are very important. I'm so pleased that communities are contacting, reaching out to us at the University of Guelph saying, you know, we have some data, we have some material here, could you have a look at it? Could you engage with us? So communities engaging with researchers and scientists will also be an important part of our exit strategy.
Thank you for that. Jacqui, Abdul-Raheem shared with us his experiences as a newcomer, and he mentioned communities within a community. And I wonder, I wanted to get your take on resilience as well, and looking forward, and what we could really do to foster that for people coping with these challenges.
Yeah, so it is a community within a community. Even though I've grown up in this area, I'd moved to a different village, and it was, even for myself, it was, you know, learning to meet new people and new traditions and new ways of doing things. So I can only imagine, you know, how difficult it is for newcomers, but also there's a responsibility on us to be welcoming and to try and reach out to people and make them feel comfortable. I think this COVID stuff has, it has created an environment where we are reaching out a little bit more. The community drive-bys for birthdays and anniversaries. Our village did village-wide craft things for people to get engaged on a common level through this COVID experience. And those things wouldn't have happened if we weren't made to. So there's a positive in that. So I'm hoping that now that we've gotten to know our more local community, because we've been stuck here, I'm hoping that that community will continue, and will continue to foster those things, rather than foster the community that we were doing perhaps over the computer and over social media, rather than the people immediately around us. If people aren't comfortable doing in-person counseling, I'm hoping that this growth in the telecounseling and telehealth will help them. It may not be perfect, but it might be an opportunity for people that otherwise wouldn't have been able to attend, or wouldn't otherwise get the treatment or help that they actually need. Services like physiotherapy, I don't think that was probably very common in terms of doing it over Zoom, but we're doing it. And you know what, maybe people are getting some of that preventative health care that they wouldn't have otherwise. So how can we make that better for rural Ontario, where access to medical services is at a premium? Someone always wins and somebody always loses, and that's unfortunate. So while it's a disadvantage for commercial real estate, I'm really hopeful that new workplaces will see that, you know, their employees can work remotely. And I'm really hoping that some of those employees choose to work remotely from rural Ontario. And that gets that economic driver simply by having people live where they work, and having them shop locally, rather than stopping at the store in the city on their way home, on their commute on the way home. And I think another positive we haven't really touched on is people building gardens and learning to grow vegetables. There's been a real increase in that. You see it on social media posts where people are building raised gardens and talking about planting more plants around their properties. Even if they don't continue to do that after the travel restrictions are lifted and they can freely go to grocery stores and stuff, maybe that's the awareness and education that we never would have got through any sort of government campaign. So I'm kind of hoping that, you know, people will enjoy growing their own vegetables, even on a small scale, and that they'll appreciate the farmers and commercial agriculture and farmers markets a little bit more when they return to shopping normally. So I see some wins and some losses, but I think there's some positives if we see them.
Super, thank you. And we're getting some questions, but before we turn to them, I just wanted to ask Ryan, you actually wrote or edited a book on rural resilience. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts on the matter of resilience before we turn to Q&A?
Yeah, there were three things that kind of came up in my mind that we've kind of talked about a little bit. So I won't chat about them in too much length, but I think one is this exciting part around re-examining our priorities, around what we want to see in our communities as we move forward. We've got priorities to kind of survive the current COVID-19 measures, but we also have priorities for thriving in a post-COVID-19 reality. And at the moment, I use often the language of people-centered economies, which I think is, Helen and I are talking the same things, but maybe different language. But it's very much focused on people as opposed to profit or other motivations that have often guided the economy. And in part of doing that, I think what we really need to ensure is that rural voices are heard. They're heard by local governments, they're heard by provincial and federal governments, because these are the people that are on the front lines, they're on the main streets, they understand the dynamics, they know their neighbors, that can provide a kind of a solid roadmap for how to move forward in all of this. I think there's also a really strong opportunity to mobilize that boots on the ground philosophy, where we can strengthen the role and the importance of voluntary and nonprofit and charitable organizations, but also entities that bridge our community, whether that's a chamber of commerce, whether that's a regional collaboration initiative. There's an opportunity to really ensure that we start working together. And it reminds me of good old Red Green, who said, we're all in this together. Which brings me to the third part that I think is really critical as we move forward, which is sharing opportunities that have both worked and have not worked. So as communities are trying their community craft initiatives, or as they're thinking about new strategies for broadband or how to welcome newcomers, we need to make sure that we're sharing these stories. We need to share them through social media, through our community newspapers and radio stations, through organizations like the Federations of Agriculture and municipal associations, perhaps even groups like the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. But we need to share what's working, but we also need to share what didn't work. And it's not because we want to announce the failures of what maybe didn't materialize, but rather this helps other communities start to think about how they might adapt some of these strategies and these initiatives to their own conditions and to their own community, which allows us to collectively learn from each other.
Thank you for that, Ryan. Now I have a couple of audience questions here that I'll pass along, and one of these is pretty practical. I think it's probably going to go first to Helen, and that's whose responsibility is it to ensure that farmers have access to broadband or 5G? Would it be governmental lobbying or NGOs or industry groups? How do you see that sort of the social license?
So it's everyone's responsibility. That's the quick answer. But let's remember, broadband services are privately owned. They're owned by large telecommunication companies, as well as small telecommunication companies that are located locally in Canada. So we are always talking about public-private partnerships, and the public sector engagement has to be very connected to the communities where the building of this type of infrastructure is involved, so that there's always community engagement. That makes it everyone's responsibility. We also have the responsibility as taxpayers in Canada, all of us, to make sure that priorities are set so that we don't keep paying for old legacy technology, old technology that just gets sort of maintained and repaired in rural areas and barely improves data throughput and security issues. So let's make sure that we have the best possible technology at the best possible prices when we make these investment decisions. So this is where the public and the private sector have to work very closely together in these efforts. And I just want to say that rural areas are used to working hard. People who live in rural areas who are farming, they're used to working hard. But I've often seen too that farmers and the agri-food industry doesn't play or doesn't team up with telecommunications very well. Why is that? In some of the most successful countries around the world, there's actually alliances between agri-food and telecoms. Why? Because these two industries know they need each other. So the more we can do to build this kind of alliance in Canada, I think it will definitely directly benefit farmers and the agri-food value chains that consumers benefit from. So that would be my 2 cents worth, Phil.
Thank you for that. Now, I wonder, does anybody have any sense or experience what one of these questions is about what rural communities may be doing since they're relying, earlier it came up the matter of folks from urban communities, sort of whether it's flocking or fleeing or whatever it is to rural places. The restrictions are sort of just soft restrictions saying don't do it. Does anybody have any experience with what communities are or might be doing to protect themselves?
I can maybe jump in with a quick response to that, Phil. I think one of the challenges is just having that communication between rural communities and their seasonal residents. Often seasonal residents in trying to move out to the rural countryside are not doing it to hinder rural communities. They're doing it because they're attracted to the landscape, to the atmosphere, to the environment that is created within our rural communities. And I think what's really necessary, and there's been a number of communities that are doing this well, is having that open dialogue with seasonal residents so that they truly understand why additional pressures might be placed on their seasonal community with their attendance at their cottage. And I think when we start to move it away from that kind of tension-filled us versus them dialogue, we start to see urban residents say, well, of course, yes, I don't wish to endanger the healthcare system of rural communities. I don't want to impact negatively the availability of food within the community. They see themselves, and they're empowered to see themselves as a contributor to the future of that rural area. And I think that's really quite critical in this dialogue.
Any other comments on that?
Yeah, the other thing I would add is that when these the people come to rural Ontario, they're not necessarily familiar with the organizations and the services that are offered there. Even the people that live here aren't, to some degree, and we try our best through marketing and advertising and social media to let people know, but it's a real challenge for some of the organizations to help people who might come here that aren't normally from here. And those people are in crisis, and we need to find a way to communicate and connect with them through other organizations.
So to leave this on something of a positive note, I'm curious what you all have to think or have to say. We know that there's a number of challenges that people in rural communities are facing, but we all also know that rural places can be amazing and really great sort of centers of innovation and caring and resilience. And so I wonder, what lessons do you think rural communities going through this can offer to urban and suburban communities in terms of surviving through the lockdown and then emerging perhaps stronger and more resilient than before?
Just to comment on that, speaking from the perspective of the work I do, we do know that for most rural communities, like over a long period of time, we've seen that there's, like I mentioned earlier, there's a disconnection between the farming and the community. But more importantly, we do know that rural communities have, for most parts, also have some kind of connection with agriculture, with their food. Like we've seen a lot of connection between people, like consumers, rural areas, and the farming industry. And if there's anything that COVID-19 has taught us, from my perspective, has been the value of food and the value of actually appreciating where our food comes from. So, and this is something that has been very inherent in our rural communities and rural life. And I think that for urban areas going forward, I think that is something that urban areas can actually learn to actually appreciate food, to actually connect with the source of their food, in order to actually make sure that going forward, we do not hope for something of this sort, but once we create that connection between consumers in urban areas and the food source as well, it will be very critical in the way we recover from this.
Super. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to share something that I've seen from the rural areas that's very encouraging. A lot of the communities in rural areas, when they lost the place that they can go in and shop, or maybe their church, and other sort of social spaces, and they became a little bit more isolated because they as well were on lockdown. One of the things that they built were networks of communication and assistance. So taking food out to people who were housebound, who couldn't get out to shop, also creating chat groups through just basic telephone contacts with one another, keeping tabs on each other, making sure that someone needed a hand on the farm, they could come over and help out. And these are examples of rural areas, self-reliance and that collective spirit that have always been there. But during the pandemic, I think those types of actions have become essential for all of us in our lives. Maybe we've become too individually oriented, certainly too much oriented to just the stress of everyday life, and the ability to just be outside and take a breath of fresh air and look at something growing. We're not going to take that for granted anymore, I don't think. So let's always remind ourselves what happened when that was taken away, and let's make sure that that never happens to us going forward, and especially to young people in Canada. Children and young people deserve everything we can do to make the situation coming out of this pandemic a healthy one and a secure one, safe one.
Well, I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding, and I think that's a really fantastic sentiment to end this webinar on. Helen, Abdul-Raheem, Jacqui, and Ryan, thank you all very much. It's been fantastic to have this conversation with all of you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So that wraps up our episode for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to our rebroadcasts of these series of webinars that have been organized by the Arrell Food Institute and the Food from Thought Initiative at the University of Guelph. The next topic of discussion will be on COVID-19 plus food insecurity. We will be rebroadcasting this webinar in 2 parts during our weekly Food Farm Talk shows airing Thursday mornings at 10 a.m. We hope you'll tune in next week. Thank you for listening, and take care.
Thank you for listening to Food Farm Talk. See you next week for another exciting edition.